Captain David Mitchell gripped the control yoke of his B-17 Flying Fortress as the No. 3 engine burst into flames over the German border, black smoke streaming behind the crippled aircraft as it struggled to maintain altitude. At 25 years old, he was completing his 25th and final combat mission, the magical number that would allow him and his 9-man crew to return home after a year of bombing raids over Nazi-occupied Europe. But on this cold February morning in 1945, as German fighters swarmed around his damaged bomber and 3 of his 4 engines were failing, David faced the most desperate challenge of his military career, bringing his crew home alive against impossible odds. The mission had begun 6 hours earlier at their base in East Anglia, England, as part of a massive 1,200 bomber raid targeting German synthetic oil refineries near Leipzig. The strategic bombing campaign was designed to cripple Germany's ability to fuel military operations, but it also required American bomber crews to penetrate some of the most heavily defended airspace in the world, facing sophisticated German fighter defenses and anti-aircraft artillery that could destroy entire bomber formations. David's B-17, which his crew had named Lucky Lady with dark humor after surviving 24 previous missions, had been flying in the lead position of the High Squadron when German fighters attacked shortly after the formation crossed the enemy coast. The first pass had been devastating. 20mm cannon fire had shredded the No. 3 engine and damaged hydraulic systems, while machine gun rounds had wounded the tail gunner and destroyed critical flight control components. The second German attack, coming just minutes after the first, had been even worse. Focused fire from multiple FW-190 fighters had destroyed the No. 2 engine, severely damaged the No. 4 engine, and killed the radio operator instantly. The No. 1 engine, the only power plant still functioning normally, was showing signs of oil pressure problems that suggested it might fail at any moment. Standard procedure when aircraft sustained such catastrophic damage was to order the crew to bail out over enemy territory, accepting capture and likely survival rather than attempting to fly a crippled bomber hundreds of miles back to England through continued German attacks. But David also understood that bailing out meant abandoning his tail gunner, Staff Sergeant Chen, who couldn't parachute due to his injuries and would certainly die if left in the falling aircraft. What would you do if saving one crew member meant risking the lives of 8 others? David's background had prepared him well for the technical challenges of flying heavily damaged aircraft, though nothing could have prepared him for the psychological pressures of making life-or-death decisions affecting 9 men who trusted his judgment completely. Born and raised on a ranch in Montana, he had learned to fly crop dusters at age 16, developing an intuitive understanding of aircraft capabilities and the ability to control planes under conditions that would ground less experienced pilots. His path to becoming a B-17 pilot had been remarkably rapid, reflecting the Army Air Force's desperate need for bomber crews during the height of American strategic bombing operations. David had enlisted in early 1943, completed flight training in 8 months instead of the peacetime standard of 18 months, and arrived in England in October 1943 to join the 305th Bomb Group at a time when bomber losses were averaging over 5% per mission. The crew David commanded had been assembled through the semi-random process that characterized wartime aircrew formation, but they had developed the tight cohesion and mutual trust essential for surviving combat operations. His co-pilot, Lieutenant James Morrison, was a former commercial pilot who provided technical expertise that complemented David's instinctive flying abilities. The bombardier, navigator, and gunners came from diverse backgrounds, but had bonded through shared experiences of 24 previous combat missions that had tested their courage and competence repeatedly. Staff Sergeant Chen, the wounded tail gunner whose injuries had precipitated the crisis David now faced, was a Chinese-American from San Francisco who had enlisted immediately after Pearl Harbor, despite facing discrimination that made military service more difficult for Asian Americans. His exceptional gunnery skills and unshakable courage had earned respect from every crew member, making the thought of abandoning him to die in a falling aircraft morally unbearable to David. The decision David made in those desperate moments after the German attacks demonstrated both his tactical judgment and his understanding of crew responsibility. Rather than ordering a bailout that would save 8 men while sacrificing 1, he announced his intention to attempt flying the crippled B-17 back to England, giving every crew member the choice to bail out immediately or remain aboard for what might be a suicidal flight attempt. "Listen up," David announced over the intercom, his voice steady despite the smoke, flames, and chaos filling the bomber's cockpit. "Number 1 engine won't last more than 30 minutes. Numbers 2 and 3 are gone, and 4 is barely turning. We're losing altitude and hydraulics, and we've got 400 miles of German-occupied territory between us and the Channel. Standard procedure says bail out now, but Chen can't jump with his injuries. I'm staying with him and trying to bring this ship home. Anyone who wants to bail out has my permission and understanding. No judgment, no questions asked. Decide now." Have you ever given people the choice to save themselves or risk everything to stay with a friend? The crew's response to David's announcement was immediate and unanimous. Not a single man chose to bail out, despite understanding that their chances of surviving the flight attempt were minimal at best. Lieutenant Morrison spoke for them all when he replied simply, "We started this mission together, Captain. We'll finish it together. Let's bring Lucky Lady home." The flight back toward England represented one of the most remarkable feats of aviation skill and determination in the history of strategic bombing operations. David was essentially flying a 65,000-pound aircraft with one functioning engine, severely damaged flight controls, destroyed hydraulic systems, and structural damage that threatened to break the airframe apart if he attempted any sudden maneuvers. The technical challenges were extraordinary and constantly evolving. The number 1 engine, providing all remaining thrust, was overheating badly and showing oil pressure fluctuations that indicated imminent failure. The number 4 engine, which David had tried to feather after it was damaged, had seized completely and was creating dangerous drag that pulled the aircraft into a slow right-hand turn, requiring constant left rudder pressure to maintain straight flight. The damaged hydraulic system meant that most flight controls required enormous physical force to operate, with David and Morrison working together to move the control yoke through the limited range of motion that remained available. The destroyed tail section had altered the aircraft's aerodynamic characteristics, making it prone to dangerous stalls at low speeds and creating control responses that felt wrong to pilots accustomed to the B-17's normal handling qualities. Most critically, Lucky Lady was losing altitude steadily at about 300 feet per minute, despite David's efforts to maintain level flight. Simple mathematics indicated that the aircraft would descend to ground level long before reaching the English Channel, meaning that David would have to find a way to stretch their glide ratio or locate an emergency landing site somewhere in German-occupied territory. David's solution to the altitude problem demonstrated both innovation and willingness to accept additional risks in pursuit of the mission. Rather than attempting to maintain level flight with insufficient power, he allowed the B-17 to descend slowly while using the remaining engine to control descent rate and maintain enough airspeed to keep the damaged aircraft controllable. The technique effectively turned the bomber into a powered glider, exchanging altitude for distance, while conserving the failing engine for critical moments when additional power might mean the difference between reaching England or crashing in occupied territory. The psychological pressures on David during this flight exceeded anything he had experienced during previous combat missions. He was responsible for 9 lives, including his own, flying a barely controllable aircraft through hostile territory with German fighters still active in the area. Every minute required intense concentration to maintain proper flight control inputs while monitoring multiple failed or failing systems and calculating whether their gradual descent would allow them to reach friendly territory. Share your thoughts in the comments below about maintaining focus during hours of extreme stress with no margin for error. The crew's contributions during the desperate flight home were as critical as David's piloting skills.
Lieutenant Morrison managed power settings on the single-functioning engine with extraordinary precision, nursing the overheating power plant through conditions that should have caused catastrophic failure, while providing exactly the thrust needed to maintain their controlled descent. The navigator, Lieutenant Thomas Burke, calculated optimal routing that would minimize exposure to German fighter bases while providing the most direct path toward the English Channel. The bombardier, Lieutenant Michael Romano, took on responsibility for managing the emergency, coordinating crew efforts to jettison unnecessary equipment that might reduce the aircraft's weight and improve their glide performance. Ammunition, guns, oxygen bottles, and anything else that wasn't essential for the flight were thrown overboard, reducing the B-17's weight by over 2,000 pounds and marginally improving their chances of reaching England. The waist gunners and ball turret gunner maintained defensive watch despite their aircraft's vulnerability, ready to call out German fighter attacks that could doom them at any moment. Their vigilance was essential because Lucky Lady's slow speed and limited maneuverability made it an easy target for any German pilot who spotted the crippled bomber limping across occupied territory. Staff Sergeant Chin, despite his severe wounds, remained conscious in the tail gunner position, providing reports on their flight path and potential threats from behind. His determination to remain functional despite injuries that would have incapacitated most men inspired the entire crew, reinforcing their collective commitment to bringing everyone home, regardless of the cost. As the flight continued, David faced a succession of crises that required instant decisions, with no opportunity for consultation or second-guessing. When the number 1 engine's oil pressure dropped to critically low levels, he had to choose between shutting it down immediately to prevent fire or continuing to run it, despite the risk of catastrophic failure. He chose to continue running the engine, understanding that without any power they would certainly crash long before reaching the channel. When hydraulic failure caused the landing gear to partially extend, creating enormous drag that accelerated their descent, David had to decide whether to attempt manually retracting the gear using the emergency system or accepting the additional drag and hoping they could still reach England. He chose to leave the gear partially extended, understanding that attempting to retract it might cause total hydraulic failure that would make landing impossible even if they reached their base. When German fighters appeared on the horizon, David had to choose between attempting evasive maneuvers that might break his damaged aircraft apart or maintaining steady course and hoping the German pilots would recognize that attacking such obviously crippled aircraft would violate the informal combat etiquette that sometimes spared crews in hopeless situations. He chose to maintain course, and the German fighters remarkably circled once, then departed without attacking, perhaps recognizing that the crippled B-17 was no longer a military threat. Let us know in the comments what you think about enemies showing mercy during warfare's brutal moments.
The most critical decision came as Lucky Lady approached the English coastline, with the number 1 engine finally failing completely, all power gone, and altitude reduced to barely 3,000 feet above the Channel waters. David could see the white cliffs of Dover ahead, so close yet still potentially unreachable if he couldn't stretch their glide just a few more miles to reach land rather than ditching in the frigid February waters that would likely kill everyone aboard. David's final gambit was to deliberately lower the B-17's landing gear fully, accepting the massive increase in drag in exchange for the limited lift that the partially deployed gear had been creating. The technique was counterintuitive and dangerous, but David's Montana crop dusting experience had taught him that sometimes accepting additional drag could paradoxically improve an aircraft's glide characteristics by forcing it into a slightly more nose-down attitude that maintained better airspeed. The maneuver worked. Lucky Lady crossed the English coastline at barely 800 feet altitude, her 3 remaining crew members wounded, her structure so damaged that she seemed held together only by the determination of her crew, her engines all silent except for the whistling wind through bullet holes that covered her fuselage. David managed to glide the powerless bomber to an emergency landing at the first airfield he could find, a small RAF fighter base that had never seen a B-17 land on its modest runway.
The landing itself was more controlled crash than conventional touchdown. With no hydraulic power for brakes or steering, David used differential braking through the emergency system and whatever control authority remained in his damaged flight surfaces to keep the aircraft roughly aligned with the runway. Lucky Lady touched down hard, bounced twice, then rolled to a stop just yards short of the runway's end, her final momentum exhausted and her structure groaning from stresses that had pushed her beyond all design limitations. As the crew evacuated the battered bomber, emergency vehicles surrounded them, and medical personnel rushed to treat Chen's injuries along with the other wounded crew members. David remained in the pilot's seat for several minutes after everyone else had left, too exhausted to move and too emotionally overwhelmed to fully process what they had just accomplished. The recognition of David's achievement came in multiple forms, reflecting both the exceptional nature of his feat and the inspiration it provided for other bomber crews facing similar desperate situations. He received the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest military decoration, for extraordinary heroism in action against an enemy of the United States, with a citation recognizing his exceptional airmanship and leadership in successfully flying a critically damaged aircraft over 400 miles through hostile territory, refusing to abandon a wounded crew member, and bringing his entire crew safely home despite facing seemingly impossible odds. But the more meaningful recognition came from his crew members, who understood exactly how close they had come to dying, and how David's skill, determination, and refusal to abandon Chen had saved all their lives. At their 50th mission reunion in 1995, 50 years after the war ended, they presented him with a plaque that read simply, "To the captain who brought everyone home. We would fly with you anywhere." Staff Sergeant Chen survived his wounds and lived until 2003, spending his life telling anyone who would listen about the pilot who had risked 8 lives to save his one life, demonstrating that military brotherhood transcended ethnic differences and that true leadership meant accepting responsibility for every person under your command, regardless of personal cost. Lucky Lady never flew again. The damage she sustained during the mission was so extensive that she was declared beyond economical repair and was eventually scrapped, her parts used to keep other B-17's flying during the final months of the war. But before she was scrapped, David and his crew were allowed to remove her nose art and mission symbols, tangible reminders of the aircraft that had brought them through 25 missions, including the desperate final flight that tested everything they had learned about courage, loyalty, and the meaning of leaving no one behind. Today, the story of Lucky Lady's final mission is taught in Air Force leadership courses as an example of how individual courage and crew cohesion can overcome seemingly impossible challenges when leaders refuse to accept conventional limitations on what might be achieved. David Mitchell's decision to attempt the impossible rather than accept the standard procedure that would have saved 8 lives while sacrificing 1 demonstrated the leadership principle that inspired crews throughout military aviation: mission first, people always, and never leave anyone behind. Captain David Mitchell died in 2018 at age 98. Having lived a long life filled with the satisfaction of knowing that his moment of decision on February 14, 1945, had saved 9 lives and demonstrated the best of what military service could represent.
His funeral was attended by surviving crew members, their children and grandchildren, and hundreds of veterans who understood that true heroism often meant choosing the harder path when easier options were available. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment to share your thoughts.